Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elizabeth Rush to the stage.
So good morning, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Byte team for that fabulous presentation and the innovative vision of the future that they presented. And I want to take a couple steps back and think about some of the larger drivers that make projects like Byte so important and steps towards how we might get there, towards how we might realize making them possible. And here I'm thinking about sort of ongoing and historical risky coastal development practices and what they might mean in the context of the 2017 hurricane season, which the reinsurance agency, Aon, recently reported will be the single most expensive quarter in history. So I think in these circumstances, it's time to consider retreat a bit more seriously. And that's something that I've spent the past 5 years exploring on the ground in different coastal communities around the country, communities that are, in the face of mounting risks, already actually doing sort of managed and voluntary retreat from the coast. And I think that Michael Kimmelman really set this panel up well. It's a topic that we don't tend to like to talk about. I noticed sitting in the audience that when he started talking about retreat, everyone like shifted in their seats. There were various interesting ways of addressing it on stage, and all the panelists this morning here are going to talk to you about retreat in communities that are already undertaking it as a form of resilience. And I just want to take a moment and set the stage in particular in the context of New York City. So after Hurricane Sandy washed ashore, in January, a couple months later, this kind of cry started to rise from the edges of the forgotten borough. And there were people who were banding together and asking to be paid pre-storm prices for their flood-prone homes that were flooding multiple times, some of them multiple lost properties. And they put signs on their lawns, Mother Nature wants her land back, and buyout wanted, buyout needed. I feel like that's a story of retreat that we don't often hear, that there are communities that after significant disaster events come together and ask to be moved. We actually have a panelist this morning, Frank Moszczynski, who's the president of the Ocean Breeze Buyout Association, one of these 9 grassroots buyout communities that came together and organized in the storm's wake. So these people went door to door, they gauged interest, they rose awareness, they mapped areas where they no longer felt safe living, and they started to view retreat instead of further systemic marginalization as an opportunity to move away from risk. They wanted to move away from their long-term vulnerability in their flood-prone homes. And they eventually brought the case to the governor, and there's a number of reasons why they probably didn't seek to advance it at the municipal level at that time. And Cuomo said, okay, let's give it a shot. He decided that he would use hazard mitigation grant funds in part to purchase homes in 3 neighborhoods along Staten Island's eastern shore. And those homes were bulldozed, have largely been bulldozed. And they're giving the wetlands space to return and to act as a buffer in the storms to come. And I want to note that not every community that wanted a buyout got one, and I think that's something we can explore in today's panel discussion. So retreat is very slowly gaining traction as a climate change adaptation strategy, and I think New York City is actually on the front lines of a lot of those discussions, and as much as it's hard to talk about, it's something, it can be a source of pride. Well, the process is pretty straightforward. You essentially buy, purchase, demolish homes that are in the floodplain and you relocate residents. As many have spoken about, the politics are considerably less so. Local governments are faced with a significant loss in tax revenue. You can see devaluation of adjacent properties. And there are ways, I think, to start to address some of those issues. So in New York City, one thing that they offered was a 5% bonus on closing. If you decided to stay within the county, New York City would give you a 5% bonus on the top of the cost of your house so that the county itself wouldn't lose those precious tax dollars. So I would say a number of people chose to stay nearby. Frank chose to stay nearby. Well, a number of people also left. And this raises the question, I think, in both cases, where do we put people who are retreating? How can our communities think about absorbing residents that are going under voluntary and managed retreat? And you know, again, in the context of the hurricane season that we've been having, a number of people, thousands and thousands and thousands in Houston, have already asked to be bought out. And Roy Wright, the director of FEMA, recently said that he's going to put buyouts of severe repetitive loss properties, properties that have flooded more than 10 times and have been rebuilt in place more than 10 times. He's going to move buying out those properties to the front of FEMA's strategies in terms of bouncing back in Houston. And again, I should say that those properties, severe repetitive loss properties, are 0.5% of the National Flood Insurance Program's portfolio, and they account for 10% of its spending. So the cost around these storms, around these flood events, continues to mount. The Sandy supplemental acquisition that we used after Sandy to bounce back from Sandy that year was $60 billion. That's literally the cost of running the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and NASA that year. So I think it's really, when we think about the future, when we think about the fact that Zillow predicts that $900 billion in property will be literally physically underwater, and that's with a very conservative climate change and sea level rise prediction estimate by 2100. We, in very select cases, have to take and consider retreat as an option. So we will be exploring this morning the ins and outs of the challenges and opportunities of considering and working with retreat on the ground. So I want to, given that context, invite our panelists onto the stage, and I'll briefly introduce each of them. So immediately to my left, we have Lisa Bova-Hiatt, the Executive Director of New York City's Governor's Office of Storm, New York's Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. She's with the state. Frank Moszczynski, I always botch your last name, the pronunciation. He's the founding member and president of the Citizens of Ocean Beach Civic Association and the project manager for rebuilding homes with New York City's Build It Back Sandy Recovery. We have Karen O'Neill, who's an associate professor of human ecology at Rutgers, and we have Mathew Sanders, resiliency policy and program administrator for the state of Louisiana Office of Community Development. And so each of these people on stage have experience firsthand with retreat. And I know that one question that often sort of gets immediately lobbed out into the retreat conversation is, so are we just going to abandon all of our coastlines? And I think the answer is no. But I'm curious, in terms of the panelists' point of view, how do you identify neighborhoods where retreat might be a viable option? And how do you, let's leave it at that. How do you identify neighborhoods, places where retreating might make some sense?
Sure. I'm so happy to be here. I love talking about retreat, and just as I do, it's like I used to love talking about eminent domain, but I think it's a very valuable conversation that a lot of people just don't want to have. I should start by saying that retreat is not the only tool in the toolbox. It's one of many things that a municipality has to look towards after an extreme weather event. And I think for us, identifying communities that were ripe for managed retreat was a combination of the communities, Oakwood Beach in particular, and Frank can talk about Ocean Breeze, but this was a community that would suffer flooding even during a light rainstorm. But what we did after Sandy was look at and partnered with the Department of State to look at inundation maps to see which areas, as we were all talking about before the panel, looking at FEMA flood maps really is incredibly helpful, especially now if you look at what happened in Houston. People who weren't in the 100-year floodplain or the 500-year floodplain are flooded. So looking at inundation maps during extreme weather and even during heavy rainfall, and really identifying neighborhoods that have the will to leave and also really need to leave. When we talk about buyouts, we talk about both buyouts and acquisition for redevelopment, because one of the things that we can't lose focus on is the fact that we can't have a disappearing housing stock. So what we did was, in partnership with the neighborhoods, particularly in Staten Island, but it was a program that was also utilized on Long Island and also upstate, but the idea of moving people in the most vulnerable areas away from the shore that had the will to leave. And then people whose properties might be flooded during a 500-year flood weather event or a 100-year weather event, having an acquisition for redevelopment program, which would acquire the properties from people who just no longer had the will to rebuild again, and transfer those properties to people who did. But when we transferred the properties, and we transferred them at a very nominal value, they would have 3 years to elevate the home and get a certificate of occupancy. So what you're doing is you're using two different tools. First, to move people as far away from possible in the most vulnerable areas, but also preserving housing stock, but making that housing stock more resilient.
Frank, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about what it was like at the community level after Sandy and what led you and your neighbors to seek retreat as an option.
Sure. One thing, after the storm, I would say 90% of the people that we had in my small Ocean Breeze area were willing to stay. And we were fortunate that the New York City Mayor's office reached out to us right away and said, we're going to help. And we had, I'll just say, 4 or 5 meetings over 3 to 4 months where we were told the next day we would be hearing from the mayor's office. And I could tell you we're still waiting. And unfortunately, in that time, it's a long time, when you left your home, you were never prepared to go back the next day, and whether if your home was washed away or every belonging you had is gone, these people, 3 months is a lifetime, and for myself included. So after a few months of not knowing where to turn and what to do, we started, and I had never heard about the buyout at all, but Oakwood Beach started this process. We were very fortunate that we reached out to them, and the person who started it, Joe Tyrone, was unbelievable in helping my community, came right down, talked to people. And something that helped us, our Civic Association was pretty strong before. So we had a good idea of, who's in the neighborhood to begin with. And we had a meeting, and we gauged some interest, and it just took off from there. And having been there for myself over 40 years, it's that combination of not just the storm, it's the 2-day rainfall, 3-day rainfall, where we're in that low-lying area and we have the floods. And also, when you look at our maps, or if you look at the area and you see in the wetland areas particularly, there's a large amount of phragmites. So when we're not flooding in those cold winter months, come March, we're worried about the brush fire situation. And these phragmites are just about protected. I don't know if they're protected more than us. So you really couldn't, for a long time, clear around your home. They finally got past that a little bit, but we've had plenty of homes that fire was melting the siding off of homes. So it's that continuous problem of having the floods, having these, worried about brush fires, and add that with not getting any help, having lost everything that you had. It seemed like that buyout was offered, and it was the first real offer to move along, and everybody embraced it.
I'm thinking 2 things at the same time, but one, just hearing you speak sort of about the surrounding wetlands. If you go out to Oakwood Beach and Ocean Breeze, Graham Beach, or if you zoom out, sort of, you do an aerial shot, you can really see that these are communities that are largely surrounded by wetlands and likely were sort of put on top of wetlands. And it's important, I think, to remember that those are areas that 100 years ago flooded so regularly that they were considered sort of ill-fit for human development. So that's, I think, can be a way to sort of start to think about where places where retreat might make some kind of sense. And that also makes me think of Mathew. You're down there in Louisiana. Coastal Louisiana is a lot of wetlands. Can you tell us a little bit more about the program that's taking place that you're a part of? Sure. So I administer 2 projects, one of which is a community resettlement project in coastal Louisiana called Ile-de-Jean-Charles. And the second is what amounts to be a large-scale planning effort to think through current and future flood risk and intend to design our future development patterns around what we understand about that risk. I think the point that you made about places that are ill-suited for human development, we've kind of caught ourselves in this position in which we made development decisions that were adverse to the information that we had at hand about current and future risk. And so, we're suffering the consequences of that, and I think we need to return to a decision point by which we understand what future risk looks like and we make our development decisions in accordance with that future risk. And so that's what we're trying to do with both of these projects. The question is that we're trying to answer, can you pick people up and achieve some economy of scale? Can you pick people up and move them to a new landscape as a group and maintain some of that cultural fabric that we value in a place like Louisiana? It really makes us unique to other locales around the country. And one of the most highly liked questions out there is, what role does the National Flood Insurance Program play in this? How does it facilitate an irresponsible built form? How can we reconsider the National Flood Insurance Program? I think, Karen, that might be one for you.
Well, the National Flood Insurance Program doesn't cover everybody, first of all. One thing that I want to touch on is the flood maps, right? Those flood maps are actually maps that estimate insurance risk. They're not estimates of your personal risk, risk to your body or risk to your house. And I think that's one thing that's really important for people to understand. And it is a difficult thing to understand because you think, well, insurance risk sounds like it's physical risk, but it's not. And yet this is sort of like our Social Security numbers, which have, the mission creep, right? We're now using Social Security numbers for all sorts of purposes. We're also using these flood insurance maps for purposes that they weren't intended. I think it's really important for people to you look at other map tools that are available. Climate Central has a map tool. We have a map tool at Rutgers University also that is a better estimate of risk because the flood maps do not include sea level rise. They do not include any projections for climate change. So that's the baseline, and this has been made through a series of decisions. I mean, primarily, the flood insurance program was built for river flooding. River flooding is more predictable than coastal flooding. I think one thing that's really clear, and maybe you had a sense of this in Louisiana also, the communities that dodged Sandy are like, awesome, we are cool. Right? And that is a really bad lesson to take away. I know along New Jersey shore, that's definitely been a pattern in the past, right? A community suffers a disaster, they kind of go into decline, and then other communities around that develop. So back to the flood insurance. We, in some communities, have a very low rate of the percentage of homeowners or business owners that are participating. And the payouts are capped. And so Frank and I were talking about whether or not even to participate in flood insurance. I think the cap is $250,000. There are certainly wealthy owners on the Jersey Shore who are going without insurance, but Frank's telling me even people with more modest homes because of the red tape. And so it's a signal. But it's not going to really do the job. It's never been built to be actuarially sound, right? So it always requires a bailout. There's nothing new about this, and it will require a nice bailout this year. But this is true from past storms too. So it's not even like climate change pushed it into that situation. So this is the problem. This is the tool that we have, and it's not really adequate.
Another question from the audience. Retreat will disproportionately hurt low-income residents, particularly NYCHA residents. How do we deal with the issue of equity in retreat?
So I'll just make an observation that we've seen in Louisiana. As we've documented population changes in our most vulnerable coastal environments, we've also seen a decline in median household income. And so we can infer from that that there is an economic decision point by which people that live in high-risk places, that have the financial flexibility to uproot themselves and live in safer places, in many cases are choosing to make that decision, and those people that are left behind are those that don't have the same financial ability to make a different decision. And so we end up with this eroding economic condition in concert with an eroding environmental condition. And so it's an array of social problems that we have to address in line with what we know about flood risk.
A lot of these communities that we've been talking about really were seen as affordable. And you hear this being expressed, particularly in Houston. Oh, Houston has all sorts of affordable housing as compared to the New York region, for example. Well, it's affordable until you're socked with, flooding. And, as we were discussing earlier, Houston has regular flooding in these areas. These are not like right on a cliff, the edge of the shore, right? So people don't perceive that. But I think historically, a lot of these areas were in the Ile de Jean Charles. Those were, it's a tribal community. Those people were effectively pushed off of other land and pushed into increasingly more hazardous zones for Staten Island. These were, again, affordable. They were beach cottages that were converted into year-round residence. So a lot of it is a past history of neglect. Now, how do we express that society as a whole has created these threats to these people? It's a tough one.
I think there's also an opportunity for municipalities to be creative. I know the governor's office, we are partnering with our affordable housing agency to rebuild affordable housing in Long Island. For example, Moxie Rigby, which was a affordable housing complex in Freeport, was completely devastated by Hurricane Sandy. And what we're doing is we are rebuilding it. We're making the rebuilt buildings more resilient. It's a one-for-one replacement. People are living in their apartments now, but they will have the right of first refusal to move in. So I think it's an opportunity to be creative and not abandon this idea of resilient, affordable housing.
My only thing to add to that would be if we have an area, and I'll just use my Ocean Breeze or one of the shoreline communities in Staten Island where we know we really shouldn't be putting anything back there, are the surrounding neighboring communities willing to accept a little denser zoning, because that's always the bad word in the room, to build some more resilient housing out of that area? And it just seems to be never happening.
But the part of that question was about NYCHA housing, and that's very different from relocating people in single-family houses. And so the issue there is just the sort of systematic defunding of public housing. They're struggling with this anyway. And the best thing we can do right now is prevent further public housing from being located in these high-risk areas, right? And this is partly a state and local government issue, because those lands have been left, they've been available to the state and local governments for development for their own purposes, and that's why they've used them. So I don't know what the solution is to NYCHA. That's very concerning.
And this, I think, sort of builds off of what Frank was talking about a little bit. So how do we create space in the surrounding neighborhoods and to absorb some of these people who are relocating? And also, how do we address that perhaps on like a larger scale? I just read an article. I used to live in Maine, and it said like, oh, the population of Maine is gonna increase, 800% because everyone's gonna head to Maine because it's gonna have a relatively stable climate and there's lots of space for development. So that's, zooming out quite a bit. But it is a sort of glimpse towards the future that people are thinking about. So how do we do it at the local level, but then how do we also think about the fact that I think there's something supposed to be like 150 million climate refugees in the United States. I could be off on that. 50? I would have to fact check myself. But there will be millions of climate change refugees in the next 100 years in the United States. So local scale, but also at a larger scale.
Well, I think it all comes down to planning. We have neighborhoods in Staten Island. The street grids are off. You drive down and you feel fat because you can't actually fit one car down these streets. The housing stock is poor. It's a hodgepodge of homes that could never be built in kind because they, precede our building code changes. And I think after an extreme weather event, you have this push-pull between recovering very quickly and long-term planning. And everyone wants to see progress, but progress takes time, bless you. And I feel like there's an opportunity, and Frank and I were talking about this just in certain communities, to really have, at least in New York City, city planning look at these areas. And I know everyone hates to talk about urban renewal areas, but it's one of the ways that you can use CBDG-DR funding. Have a plan for smart redevelopment in areas where there should be housing, but make it resilient housing so that it's ready for the next storm. I think planning is definitely key, and I'm not a planner, but I know that you see these communities that are just hit over and over. And I think that's really the only way to start the ball rolling. But there has to be a dialogue, and people have to understand that if you don't plan, then the next extreme weather event, you're never going to have the progress that you need.
I agree.
Well, I think there's a good point to be made here, though, that in post-disaster landscapes, most of the funding mechanisms are designed to be replacement programs. And so, they're not structured in such a way that we can look at a geography and anticipate a future condition, a future population, and design around that which we can anticipate. And so Lisa mentioned CDBG-DR funding. It's a little more flexible. But, for example, you can't use that funding tool for land banking purposes, for example, right? It's explicitly forbidden. But if we were able to use a funding mechanism like that and think through a geography that might have a favorable risk profile and acquire it on behalf of the public and think through transportation networks and development patterns and design for a population that we would want to live in this place that would be ostensibly safer, I think that's the approach we need to start taking as a country.
There's a recent piece of research in geography looking at exactly that in terms of the entire US, and they're looking at places like Atlanta as a site for people relocating. The concern, of course, is where are people going to go, and are those also vulnerable to different climate shocks? And so if you look worldwide, we've been always very concerned about informal settlements because what we're seeing is an increase of people in explicitly vulnerable sites, and if they're unplanned, to go back to that, it's really much worse. And of course, Atlanta is not big for planning, Houston is not big for planning. So if people are going to move to the Southwest, this is not, great. Now, I don't know about Maine, but my guess is they're not terribly big on planning either. Yeah, so it's a libertarian streak.
Which brings up the question, so it's a touchy subject, and I think everyone here has given serious thought to how do you create political will for those select cases where managed retreat might make sense sooner rather than later. Can you give us some ideas that you've explored from your own experience?
Well, it's interesting. In the context of Hurricane Sandy, there was certainly political will, but it really started on a community level. And I think that's just so fabulous because when you think about whether it's managed retreat or if you think about community reconstruction, nobody knows better what a community needs, what intersections flood, what homes are the most vulnerable than the people who actually live there. And I think having government provide communities with a tool and then having the community feed the information that basically they know the best, working together is really the best way to proceed.
I agree, and I think for us, what we experienced is the state stepping in because, we said a lot of other areas didn't have the planning. We didn't have it in New York either. And I can tell you that because, again, we had those few 3, 4, 5 months of talks with the mayor's office. And again, in the biggest city in the world, we weren't prepared. We didn't have that plan. So when a plan was touted where there was, an end, that's when we started to do that. So you need that, I agree, you need that local buy-in from the community, and they need to actually, I think, just strengthen that going forward with the communities, and they need that open dialogue now rather than later.
Something that I noticed in my research was that the communities that have been advocating on their own behalf for retreat often had pretty extensive records through community knowledge of ongoing flooding. So that's something that I heard sort of at the political level that really helps those communities. If you have that record, well, it makes the argument for retreat that much clearer. And it's true that that knowledge really exists at the community level. So, good question. How do you build community support for buyout programs during periods when there isn't an acute threat? How do you build support for this before the storm instead of after it?
Well, I mean, I think, so in Louisiana, I talk a lot about how my office has a recovery portfolio of $16 billion emanating from Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, Isaac, and 2,000-year flooding events last year in March and August. And so, every parish, we have parishes in Louisiana instead of counties, every parish in the state of Louisiana has been under a major disaster declaration from a flooding event over that 12-year period of time that I just outlined. And so I think we have a unique opportunity in Louisiana in that everybody has been impacted by a flooding event in the near term. And so we can have more provocative conversations about topics like managed retreat. And I think, if we're able to have that conversation and we're able to build out effective models, have a few success stories, if we're able to successfully move this Ile-de-Jean-Charles community and use it as an example and as a tool to go into similar communities and illustrate how we can effectuate a better outcome, I think that's really what we have to do moving forward. And I think we'll be able to build out that political support. We'll be able to build out local support if we have something that we can go show people. We can say, look, if you stay where you are right now, we understand what the consequences are. You have flooded out several times. But if we go this other path through this managed retreat tool, we can do something a little better.
Yeah, and visuals are really important. And so literally showing people, using maps, but also showing some of these techniques that you were discussing about different approaches that you can use. And it's not just retreat. There's always going to be a combination of pulling back some things, demolishing some things, accommodation by raising in some sections, and building walls in selected places. Unfortunately, the emphasis is too often just on building the walls and not seeing these as a suite of things that can be used. But showing pictures, and we find that they have to be in the region, right? People want to see, well, who cares about whether that worked in Miami? I want to know if it works here. And some of that's legitimate, right? Some of that really are distinctive topographies, but yeah, showing pictures is quite helpful. So I think there's a role for design that's really important.
How about the more ugly side of retreat? So how do we address potential adjacent property devaluation? And how do you deal and address with the potential of loss of tax revenue through property taxes in these communities?
I actually think that the areas next to a retreat area their value should go up. If you think about Oakwood Beach, the areas above Mill Road are now far more protected than they ever were because the water has a place to go. Although sometimes that's very hard to explain to people. But if it's true managed retreat where the property is remaining open space, there are creative ways for passive recreation that should make those properties more valuable. The challenge is where you draw the line, right? So I'm taking your house, but I'm not taking your house, I'm taking your neighbor's house. At some point, there has to be a demarcation line between what's upland and what's the retreat area. And I think using tools like acquisition for redevelopment, where they sort of work hand in hand, right? You have an area that will never be rebuilt, but the upland areas, areas where with smart rebuilding and smart resiliency, you can have housing stock. I think those have to work in tandem.
There's different mechanisms happen in different real estate markets. So the real estate markets that are already going up when a disaster hits, that becomes an opportunity for redevelopment at a higher level of price point. For areas that are going down before the disaster hits, it tends to be something that forces that community down farther. And so it's not always uniformly good to live in an area where some retreat has happened. But yes, otherwise, I think that these things do kick in.
And how about the land after a buyout has happened? You mentioned that it has to be open space. If you're using HMGP funds, it has to be open space in perpetuity. So what are some of the plans that we see in Oakwood and in Louisiana that 10, 15, 20 years down the line, what's going to happen with these spaces? And how does that contribute to the overall sort of potential future success of the city that it's located in, or the state that it's located in, or the community that it's located in?
Well, I mean, I think part of what you're alluding to is why people have an aversion to buyouts. And they end up becoming a burden for the local governments and jurisdictions that ultimately have to maintain these properties and keep them as open space. I mean, I think in the state of Louisiana, we're experiencing something slightly different in that as land is physically eroding away. So just as an example, the state of Louisiana has never exercised its riparian rights. And so, I mean, I think as we have this functional breakdown of land itself, we as a state probably need to look at, at what point do we step in and exercise our ability to acquire a piece of property that is eroding away, maybe before it's underwater. So, I think you're right, and I think we need to think through some of the uses for these types of properties that are bought out, as opposed to just perpetual open space. Do we have some, functional recreational use we can put on these properties? But yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem. Nobody wants to participate in a buyout because it's a burden.
There's actually some interesting evidence about the potential fiscal impact, and that is that it often is not effective to rebuild in place in terms of the tax revenue for the city because of the costs of keeping those places in operation. You cannot withdraw services from a neighborhood unless 100% of the people are gone. And so the city still has to do garbage, they have to repair the roads, and then, of course, private utility companies also have to provide service, the U.S. Postal Service. Those are costs. Some of those are borne by the local government, and that is often not figured in to these calculations. And I think it's often, we don't admit to ourselves what costs are being socialized to other people, to other levels. And I think once you factor those in, some of this actually does make sense to let properties, to buy them out.
So I was out in Oakwood Beach this past weekend checking in on the buyouts and was really just amazed to see some of the wetlands coming back, but also equally surprised to see, I want to say it's like the F-78 bus, still runs. Oh. I mean, I saw it going by and there's very few people still living out there. So I'm curious also, perhaps as a final question, we just have a minute, to pose, so what happens when you have a buyout that has 97% of the people leave, and what happens with those 3%? You still provide services. Is there discussion around who or how they can sell their homes in the future? Can anyone speak to those questions?
I think in a place like Oakwood Beach, the people that are staying are people that are not staying because they want to. I think sometimes there are other issues, whether they're title issues or underwater mortgages. So trying to come up with creative solutions to actually move them out of harm's way. If you walk through Oakwood Beach, I mean, it went from a densely populated, incredible sense of community neighborhood to really tumbleweeds. You know, after we demo buildings, we walk with the Parks Department and we put in native seed just to make sure that the area is being repopulated with native plants. But I don't think anyone wants to live in a neighborhood where they're the only house on the block. And I think coming up with creative solutions to move them when they're ready to move is probably the most helpful.
Thank you all for being with us this morning. It was a pleasure.